The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Very important news this morning. We have heard now that the Pacific Trade Ministers have reached a deal on the controversial Trans-Pacific Partnership after almost, 5 years at this point of mostly secret negotiations. This is going to cut trade barriers. It's going to set common standards for the 12 countries involved. And reportedly, this could influence everything from the price of cheese to the cost of cancer treatments. There are tariff reduction schedules on hundreds of imported items from pork and beef in Japan, pickup trucks in the United States, and this would affect 40% of the world economy. Lawmakers in all of the TPP involved countries do need to approve the deal, but we have gone past what is apparently the final round of negotiations in Atlanta, Georgia, which started Wednesday. The sticking point, the reason why we didn't get an agreement even sooner, was apparently a disagreement of sorts on how long pharmaceutical companies should be able to have monopolies on next generation biotech drugs. The US and Australia negotiated a compromise. That's exactly right. These are the parameters of the discussion on TPP. How long should the companies have monopolies on the best next generation of medications that presumably can make us healthier and cure disease? How long should that monopoly be? The United States wanted 12 years of protection, and Australia, New Zealand, and other public health groups wanted 5 years. They believed that that would bring down costs more quickly. So this is just a microcosm of the sort of range of debate that existed within TPP, as Bernie Sanders has been talking about for a long time, as reasonable economists have been talking about for a long time. This isn't really a trade deal. Mostly advocates of Trans-Pacific Partnership are talking about it as a trade deal. It is a wholesale reorganization of corporate power. This is a disaster. We're going to cover it extensively as we continue to get more information. The cliff notes are, it's going to be good for big corporations. It's going to be great for corporations skirting national law by setting up mechanisms in which they can circumvent the court systems of individual countries. It's going to be bad for the environment. It's going to be bad for workers. It's going to be bad for patients within our for-profit healthcare industry. But if you follow the money, it's pretty easy to figure out who it will be good for. So the breaking news is that an agreement has been reached with regard to Trans-Pacific Partnership. If you haven't heard about it already, you probably pay attention mostly to corporate news. And by that, I mean not this agreement, but the entire fiasco around the secret negotiations of TPP. No real incentive, as we've talked about, for corporate media to cover TPP. And there has been mostly a wholesale blackout of TPP for a long time now on corporate media. You probably heard the big news over the weekend, 26-year-old male shooter going into Umpqua Community College in Umpqua, Oregon, shooting 9 people dead, injuring many others before ultimately killing himself following a gun battle with the police officers that responded. The 26-year-old shooter lived with his mother very close to the community college, described himself on social media as well as on online dating profiles as a, quote, conservative Republican. The shooter was carrying, by some reports, at least 3 weapons, by other reports, as many as half a dozen weapons, including a long gun and multiple handguns. 7 other weapons were recovered from the home where he and his mother lived, according to officials. For more context, and this is really important, you should know that the shooter's mother bragged about the number of guns that she owned. She argued in favor of so-called open carry gun laws in chat rooms and on social media websites. She posted, quote, "You can't be that naive, can you? It's ridiculously easy to understand the apprehension associated with open carry. I moved from Southern California to Oregon, from Southern crime mania to open carry. An open carry law won't work anywhere, and when the mood strikes, and as long as we're tossing around brand names, I sling an AR, Tech 9, or AK over my shoulder, or holster a Glock 21, or one of my other handguns like the Sig Sauer P226 and walk out the door, I find the shotguns are a little too cumbersome to open carry. The shooter, seemingly obsessed with mass shootings, including recently downloading a BBC documentary about the Sandy Hook tragedy called Surviving Sandy Hook. Now, things you will hear and that we've already been hearing in response to this shooting and why they don't make sense. People saying, oh, don't politicize the gun element of this tragedy. That is ridiculous. The gun element of this tragedy is political. And it's political because of one political party and the ideology that they have with regard to guns that is not helping to stop this kind of thing. Those who say don't politicize it have been politicizing it in the exact wrong way. You'll hear others say this isn't really about guns. It's, for example, about mental illness. That's also ridiculous. Of course, most people who go on a shooting rampage like this have mental stability issues, but the overwhelming, drastic, insurmountable majority of mentally ill people do not go on mass shootings. They are not violent. They are not a danger to themselves or to others or to society, period. So saying it's just about mental illness is a distraction. Yeah, we need to talk about mental illness in the US, but we also have societal illness here, where much more than in other countries, people think about using guns to solve problems or to remedy situations that they don't like, and that is a societal problem. And then lastly, and this is particularly insane in this particular situation, don't blame the guns, blame the parenting. Specifically, this particular shooter's parenting, apparently, which was focused on open carrying guns rather than raising well-adjusted kids. At least one student was carrying a gun on campus when the attack occurred, but John Parker Jr. decided not to intervene. And as we've talked about many times, the idea that good guys with guns in these situations makes everything better is ridiculous. Think about it in the context of the Aurora, Colorado shooting. An FBI analysis of 160 active shooter situations between the years 2000 and 2013 showed, not surprisingly, that only one of those shootings was stopped by a concealed carry license holder who happened to also have been a U.S. Marine. 4 were stopped by armed guards who were armed as part of the sort of status quo of that situation. 2 by off-duty police officers, and 21 by unarmed civilians. The idea that concealed carry heroes in these situations make the situation better is empirically false. The last thing I want to touch on is people very quickly get into this talking point coma of laws. Gun laws don't deter criminals who are determined to get guns illegally. It's very weird because the same right-wingers say voter ID laws will work to deter people from fraudulent voting, which, by the way, essentially doesn't exist. Drunk driving laws do deter people from driving drunk. Laws against murder make sense. Nobody's arguing to get rid of murder laws and statutes because, hey, if you're determined to murder someone, it doesn't matter what the law is. But all of a sudden, gun safety laws do nothing. Now, as we talked about it with Evan D. Philippus recently in his analysis of the data, gun laws do deter some would-be criminals. Gun laws make obtaining guns, practically speaking, a little more difficult for another portion of would-be criminals. But also, and very importantly, gun laws create a very specific framework under which we can prosecute violation of those laws. So it is not merely for its deterrent effect that we have these laws. We have the laws because they are part of the framework that is a logical part of society. And of course, that allows us to then give proper punishment to those who ignore the law. Now, one of the most disturbing elements of this entire fiasco, aside from the fact that a 26-year-old killed 9 people in yet another mass shooting, are the details of Douglas County Sheriff John Hanlin, and I want to discuss that next. Douglas County Sheriff John Hanlin is the sheriff involved in dealing with the aftermath, we can say, of the shooting perpetrated by 26-year-old self-described conservative Republican, son of a gun nut mother in Umpqua Community College, Umpqua, Oregon. Okay, what do we know about Sheriff John Hanlin? We know that he strongly opposed gun safety measures that were recently proposed in Oregon. We know that he is a member of the public gun-toting militia known as the Oath Keepers, which we've reported on. This is the same group who said they would use their guns to prevent Bigot Kim Davis from going back to jail for breaking the law in Kentucky. Rob Price told the Trace magazine that while Hanlin is not an official member of the Oath Keepers, he attends meetings and he offers guidance on gun laws and Second Amendment issues, and was described as active by Rob Price. In 2013, Sheriff Hanlin wrote a letter to Vice President Joe Biden saying, if the federal government passes any gun safety legislation, including that mandating expanded background checks for private sales, that he would refuse to follow those laws. We are linking to the letter in the description to this in this YouTube clip. It is laughably asinine, but it goes even further. The month after the December of 22 Sandy Hook massacre in Newtown, Connecticut, Sheriff John Hanlin posted a video called "The Sandy Hook Shooting Fully Exposed." This is another one of these conspiracy theory videos about Sandy Hook, including ideas that there was more than one shooter, that the grieving parents who appeared in the media were actually actors, Alex Jones stuff. So, in thinking of the entire context of this horrible, tragic shooting in Umpqua, Oregon, let's not fall for this trick that the pro-gun nuts are using of, hey, don't talk about gun safety laws because that's politicizing an event that shouldn't be political. No, this is a political event because of the status quo around guns in this country. Let's not forget, in addition to that, that the last almost 3 years that we know of from Sheriff John Hanlin may well be at least a part of the context in which this shooting happened. And that is truly disturbing and horrible. And we're going to continue talking about that during the week as we get more information about it.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
This program depends on the funding of our audience to stay on the air. You can sign up at davidpakman.com/membership. Today's new member of the day is Karen Mitchell. Karen, thank you so much for being a David Pakman Show member. Thanks to Karen and other David Pakman Show members, our program continues to grow. You can help us continue to grow by going to davidpakman.com/membership. If you ever shop on Amazon.com, go to davidpakman.com/Amazon before you do your shopping, and everything you buy will send us a little kickback. It's a great way you can support our program with the shopping you already plan to do. Several people over the last week through our link buying these radar, laser, and LiDAR detectors for their cars. I used to have one of these years ago, and I haven't for a really long time. In part because I just don't really speed. I think maybe I sped a little more when I was younger, but now I find myself just not speeding, so I don't really find myself having a reason to have these. Do these even still work? I know that some of the technology used by police to measure the speed of individuals on the road has changed. Apparently, if they're called LiDAR detectors, maybe they still do work, but if you have any personal experience with this, let me know. Also, really glad that somebody purchased one of my recent documentary recommendations, Kumare, which is a documentary about a fake and I to the extent that any of them are real, a fake guru, a scam guru named Vikram Gandhi. I love that documentary, Kumare. Glad that somebody bought that through our link. And remember, anything you buy on Amazon, go to davidpakman.com/Amazon, then make your purchases. Okay, we have to follow up about this story involving Pope Francis and bigoted Kentucky County Clerk Kim Davis. It turns out that much of what we were told about the so-called private meeting of Kim Davis and Pope Francis, where Pope Francis supposedly issued some statement of support to Kim Davis for her bigotry, have been lies. News of the meeting was shocking among many progressives, and part of the reason was that it seemed to really contradict the sort of general tone of Pope Francis's tour in the United States. The Vatican has now released a statement saying, the recent meeting between Pope Francis and Kim Davis should not be seen as a form of support of her position on gay marriage licenses. And the most stunning detail that has now emerged is that it was not a private meeting. Kim Davis was in a group of dozens of people that the Pope met with simultaneously. She was apparently invited by the Vatican's ambassador to the U.S. in Washington, and the Vatican added that Kim Davis's anti-gay, bigoted lawbreaking was not even mentioned during the meeting with the Pope. Further, it doesn't appear that the Pope even had any clue about who this woman was. We also learned, and this is angering a lot of people who were thrilled about the supposed meeting with Kim Davis, we have now learned that just before this meeting with dozens of people, including Kim Davis, the Pope actually held a private meeting with a longtime gay friend and his partner. So the question now is, how did Kim Davis get into the same room as the Pope? Archbishop Carlo Maria Vigano apparently arranged the Pope's meetings in Washington. He is apparently the one responsible, and he is expected to be removed at the first respectable opportunity. Every indication that the Pope was sort of tricked into meeting Kim Davis in this large group. And the obvious question was, why would Kim Davis, who is not a Catholic, in fact, she's an apostolic Christian, which could not be further from Catholicism, why would she even want to meet with the Pope? That was sort of the ongoing question. Her seeming attention whoring might suggest that she would just want an opportunity to meet with any religious figure of note that would support what she's doing, absolutely backfiring. And not only is Kim Davis a bigot, not only is Kim Davis refusing to do her taxpayer-funded job, not only is Kim Davis entangled with some of the most retrograde and vile religious elements of the American right, she's also a flat-out liar. There was no private meeting. The Pope offered no support. These are the lowest bottom-feeding losers among all the ranks of bottom feeders, and I'm thrilled that the truth is finally coming out. Over the weekend, Bernie Sanders was in Massachusetts, spoke to a crowd of over 20,000 people in Boston on Saturday night. This is the largest rally in recent state history, according to the Boston Globe. 8 years ago, President Obama drew 10,000 people. Bernie Sanders doubling that. The Boston Convention and Exhibition Center was absolutely packed. Bernie Sanders focused on his opposition to big money donors, saying, quote, "I don't have a super PAC, I don't want a super PAC, and I don't need a super PAC." Let's break that down. I don't have a super PAC. That's true. I don't want a super PAC. I believe him. I don't need a super PAC. We will see. I know that Bernie Sanders recently gathered almost as much in donations as Hillary Clinton during the third quarter of this year. If he does become the eventual Democratic nominee, which is still an uphill battle, no question about it, he is maybe going to want the super PAC in spite of the fact that he won't set it up himself, and he very well may need that super PAC to have a real shot. We will see about that, but we still have a very, very long way to go. I'm going to be in Las Vegas next week covering the first Democratic debate, and we will be at Mike Papantonio's conference in Las Vegas as well. Mike Papantonio, attorney and host of Ring of Fire. Big week next week, and we will see what the impact is on polling from that first Democratic debate. Okay, after the break, football. We know about all of the moral and ethical dilemmas happening right now with football, and I'm going to be joined by Steve Almond, who has taken a very specific and proactive approach to his relationship with football, a sport that he has loved for his entire life. Really interesting interview coming up after the break.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
I'm joined today by Steve Almond, author of Against Football, One Fan's Reluctant Manifesto, which is just out in paperback. The book is super interesting, Steve, and you're an admitted football fan who is sort of trying to rid yourself of football, and you have a number of ethical concerns around the game, which we'll get to. And, you know, in preparing for this interview, I was reminded of an interview I did with the Nation's Dave Zirin around the last World Cup, where he presented all sorts of very strong indictments of FIFA and of World Cups more broadly, but still said he doesn't think it's unethical or immoral to watch because you enjoy the game of soccer, but that you should be simultaneously advocating for change. Now, when it comes to football for you, you feel that that is not an okay solution. In other words, you really need to rid yourself of football, as you say.
Well, I think the book is trying to present the football for what it really is, the biggest central narrative in American culture, the most popular sport, the most profitable sport, the largest activity or narrative that we all have in common. I think it's bigger than religion at this point. It's bigger than the bonds of family in many cases. And I'm really interested in what it means, both as a phenomenally interesting game narrative, and also maybe even as almost like a spiritual thing for a lot of people, but also what the dark side of it is. So the book isn't trying to say you should do this or you should do that, but you should know exactly what it is you're sponsoring when you sit down to watch a game. And I think that's the place where I do depart from somebody like Dave Zirin, although I really appreciate how intelligently he writes about sports and how morally grounded he is as a commentator. I think it's very basic. Roger Goodell and the folks who run the big college football programs and the whole football industrial complex, they don't care whether you're guilt-stricken. They don't care whether you are sort of cheering with a big foam rubber hand in one hand and maybe with a fist sort of advocating with the other, because they're really keeping score in a very basic way. Are you a sponsor? Are you tuning in? Are you contributing to the revenues of big football? And the answer is yes. If you're a fan, that's what you're doing. But that's my answer. There are a lot of people who are going to read the book and say, well, I might cut back on my consumption, or I might become more active and involved when it comes to questioning how my tax dollars are spent at the level of high school or pro or college football. So it's not trying to advocate any one solution like boycott football. It's much more, hey, you should think about what everything that football is, because it's extraordinarily complicated and it's woven through the fabric of almost everything we do in America at this point.
Give us the sort of bullet points of what these areas of concern are. And then, you know, I have some that I'm going to want to dive into. The ones that to me strike me are, of course, this pervasive brain injury disaster and systematic cover-up that has been exposed several times now.
Right.
And how that impacts how we see college football and even high school football, really.
Right.
The corporatism, no question about that. The greed, which some write off as sort of billionaires versus millionaires, which is not at all the reality, as Dave Zirin has exposed when we look at owners versus players. What else is there?
Well, I think there are things that are a little bit squishier and more subtle, but you know, the major thing is that you have to accept that you're watching a form of entertainment in which you incur none of the risk and in which up to a third of the pro players are going to get brain damage. That's the big one that, for me, having seen my mom suffer a cognitive collapse, basically, I just kind of turned my stomach. But beyond that, and beyond the sort of the greed that's just sort of built into American capitalist culture, are issues that have to do with the way that masculinity is defined and femininity, the way that sort of gender and orientation work. And I think the main thing that really troubled me, the more I thought about two things really, the way in which football has become inextricably linked to the educational process in this country at the high school and college level. That just makes no sense to me, that a game that essentially segregates people and values them purely for their physical worth, and that also clearly now the research indicates has deleterious effects on people's brain function, somehow are a huge part of our educational system and the tax dollars that are spent on it. And the other thing is that it really sanitizes and normalizes violence. I think in this way it's symptomatic of American culture. But the thing about football that just makes it distinct from something like rugby or especially boxing is we really come to believe, as when we watch football, we allow a certain kind of magical thinking to infect us. We honestly think that a 280-pound player who comes up against another 300-pound player, with 70 G-forces, maybe 100 times a game, isn't going to be permanently damaged and maybe even brain damaged by that contact. We allow ourselves to believe that it's not real violence. And I think that abstracting of what real violence is and its real human toll is the same mentality that's in operation when, for instance, we send soldiers overseas and they suffer whatever they suffer. And then when they come back to the United States, we just aren't particularly interested in their suffering.
Do you think that, well, let me frame it a different way. There's many people I know who, if I said to them, football really has this inherent tolerance for what are debilitating brain injuries to a significant percentage of the players. Football really has this tolerance for this total corporatism. Football tolerates even arguably homophobia and even racism in some cases, blah, blah, blah. And they would look at me and with a totally straight face, they would say, David, I know what you're saying, but right. I just like watching the game. I don't believe any of those things, and watching the game isn't going to change my opinion. Is right. that a valid defense in your mind, or are you legitimizing those problems merely by watching?
I don't know that you're legitimizing them. I think you're consuming and really in that way kind of taking part in a game that has certain values that we really would never condone outside the realm of football. That's what's so amazing about football. It's such a remarkable spectacle. It's so thrilling, and our attachment to it is so deep that we essentially throw whatever moral qualms we might have out as citizens, as parents, as maybe even as people of faith. Those go out the window. If you think about how Jesus would regard the Jesus I'm talking about, sort of the Sermon on the Mount, who was turn the other cheek, avoid violence.
Right, not the evangelical right-wing Jesus.
Well, right, the guy who was, turning over the money changers' tables, who was a radical who believed in the gospel of love as a revolutionary force. Yeah. That Jesus would look at football and say, oh, I recognize that. The nearest cognate I have is the spectacles that the Romans throw, these gladiatorial combats where there's clear bloodlust, there's a clear effort to distract the people from incompetent venal leadership and from a kind of injustice that I am my whole mission is to put across, that we've got to be more merciful and kind and less violent towards one another. A lot of people would say they believe in what Jesus said on the Mount, and then they would, watch a football game, and when a running back scores a touchdown by knocking the linebacker senseless and says, thank God, I'm glad, I believe in God, and I'm glad he was watching over this gridiron, they would see no sense of cognitive dissonance. But in this sense, David, it's really, it's more typical of an American human, but especially an American mindset. That is, we love certain pleasures in this culture, but we don't like interrogating those pleasures morally. It's very unpleasant. We all love bacon, or most of us do, but we certainly have no interest in going to the slaughterhouse. what my book is attempting to do is to say, look, I loved football for 40 years as a sport and as a spectacle. It's ecstatic and beautiful. It's the body at play. It's greatness and poise and discipline and teamwork and all these virtues, many of them manly, but still virtues that are nothing but laudable. And also, while you're consuming all that, there's also this other stuff. And this other stuff is really, you're a part of the larger system that fosters that. You talked about homophobia as like maybe the NFL is homophobic. It's not a maybe. When you have a collective freak out at the idea that a single gay employee is going to enter your workforce,
Right.
That's just, when you look at any other workplace, we would never accept that. Maybe the Catholic Church or, an evangelical business, but we would never accept that in most other realms of our life. Just like we would never accept a workplace where the ownership says, yeah, 30% of the employees are going to get long-term cognitive ailments, but what are you going to do? It's just they incur the risk. They know what they're doing. We don't watch coal miners get black lung, right? But we could all recognize that it was a real problem and the workplace needed to change. We are actually watching the coal miners get black lung. That's what we're doing every Sunday. We're watching guys who are getting brain damage, and we're seeing some of them take their own lives or sort of suffer in silence years later. And we're saying collectively and individually, I'm okay with that.
And have you successfully stayed away from watching football the first 3 weeks of the current season?
I have to say I have, but it's not easy because, because I am a sports fan, I check to see, what's going on with the baseball team I follow, and are there any interesting highlights? And also, sports is on everywhere. It's sort of the national wallpaper. And I do notice that my team, the long-suffering Oakland Raiders, seem to somehow miraculously not be doing terribly. In fact, doing surprisingly well. So now the real challenge comes in. It's not when your team is lousy and you turn away. It's when your team is doing great and you then have to turn away. And I just want to say, it's not like I'm loving it or just sitting there going, oh, well, what a dumb game, and I can't believe I ever watched it. I know exactly why I watched it. It's unbelievably alluring. And all my book is trying to do is say, what is it like when you have to walk away from something you really love? Because you learn so much about it that you realize there's a lot of unlovable parts to it that are sort of infecting you without your entirely realizing it.
Let me remind everybody, the book is called Against Football, One Fan's Reluctant Manifesto. It's now out in paperback. We've been speaking with the book's author, Steve Almond. Thank you so much for telling us about it.
Absolutely. Thank you.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
For a long time now, I've been talking with you about the idea that there are elements within so-called progressives and the progressive movement that are actually quite anti-progressive or even regressive in some cases. And this has caused a lot of sort of conflict between elements of progressivism and people like Sam Harris and Bill Maher and Richard Dawkins, etc. I've spoken with Dave Rubin about this on the program before, and there's an interesting clip from the most recent episode of Real Time with Bill Maher, where Richard Dawkins and Bill Maher actually talk about what they describe as the regressive left. Let's take a look at that.
Because our friend Sam Harris coined an interesting word this week, a phrase, regressive leftists. The people who don't quite get it about being liberals in the world. I know you were championing somebody named Maryam Namazi, and you and our great friend Salman Rushdie got her reinstated. She was going to speak, as so many people have at universities, and then they get disinvited because she's an ex-Muslim and was just speaking her mind, but apparently that's hate speech in this world. So what did you and Salman...
I am shocked about the way on university campuses the principle of free speech, when I think that the old university I went to, University of California at Berkeley, the free speech movement in the 1960s, what a betrayal we're seeing now.
Right.
With campuses all over the Western world, all over America and Britain, are denying people the right to come and speak at campuses. If you can't speak your mind on a university campus, where can you? I mean, that's what universities are about. It's about free speech. It's about being brought... It's about being exposed to ideas that you haven't met before, perhaps you're hostile to. If you only ever get exposed to ideas that you agree with, what kind of a university would that be?
But also this notion that somehow Islam and Muslims are this protected species, that if we talk about them at all or criticize at all, it's somehow hurting or humiliating Muslims.
Yes.
And it's a ridiculous idea.
And it's confused with racism as well, because an incredible number of people think Islam is a race.
Yes. Oh, I've heard that, yeah. Right.
And so they think that if you criticize Islam, you're being racist.
Right, or...
and you're absolutely right that the regressive Muslims give a free pass to Islam, whereas they kind of write about everything else. I mean, they write about misogyny and all the other bad things in that case.
You're talking about repressive leftists, yes, liberals, yeah.
Yes. But in the case of Islam, it just gets a free pass.
Yeah.
And I think it's because of the terror of being thought racist.
Right. Or at worst, an Islamophobe.
Islamophobe, yes.
Yes,
yeah.
a silly word that means nothing.
Yes.
I mean, it's so dumb because, you know, all the people who are accused of being Islamophobes, like you and me and Sam and Ian, we're liberals. We're liberals about everything.
Yeah.
I mean, from the time I was a child in my home, I was 7 years old when my parents told me, we're for Kennedy, and him trying to let black people go to college in the South. I didn't even know who black people were. There weren't any in my town. I knew we were on their side, and then we were on the side of Cesar Chavez and the lettuce pickers, and then we were on the side... Then we were on the side of the women's movement and poor and the minorities, whatever it was, gay people, the disabled, the abused, the molested.
I had an interview some time ago, maybe about a year or so ago, with Dave Rubin, host of the Rubin Report, where we discussed exactly this. And there are so many different elements to this that it is really difficult to discuss concisely. But I think that the absolute most important element of this is that sometimes elements of the progressive movement get lost in talking points and generalities in a way that makes them support ideas or values that are not truly progressive. The one that is addressed by Richard Dawkins and Bill Maher, the idea around criticism of Islam and Muslims, is one that we have identified. We have also identified one around the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I mean, just today, I received a bunch of emails from people saying, David, Israelis just killed more Palestinians. You have to condemn it. And indeed, the Palestinian Authority condemned Israel for killing 2 Palestinians. When you look at the actual information, the 2 Palestinians killed were attackers. One, a 19-year-old law student who killed 2 Jewish Israeli men and was in a shootout with Israeli troops after he grabbed one of his victim's guns and started firing. When you read the reports from many progressive media outlets, you hear, Israel, they killed Palestinians. The reality is these were individuals who killed others. They murdered someone and took their gun. The other was Fadi Aloun, a resident of the eastern Jerusalem neighborhood of Isawiya, who was killed yesterday morning while being pursued by police officers after stabbing a 15-year-old Israeli teen in Jerusalem. One person had just murdered someone and taken their gun. The other was in a police chase after stabbing a kid. When would progressives apply the same standard anywhere else? We have to be thinking more critically here. This doesn't mean that we support Israeli settlements. This doesn't mean that as progressives, we support the right-wing, fundamentalist involved administration of Benjamin Netanyahu. I have been speaking against those anti-progressive ideas for a very long time, but ignoring empirical realities and buying into propaganda is not something that I'm going to be doing. And to the extent that people like Bill Maher and Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris are talking about that, I agree with them. To the extent that those who subscribe to the ideology of Harris, Maher, and Dawkins use that ideology to be xenophobic or racist or whatever, I completely denounce those uses. And we have to be able to speak in nuance here rather than in generalities. That's just the reality. Very interesting clip from the Bill Maher program. There's a recent study in the Journal of Sex Research, that is, which challenges the notion that men who watch porn are more likely to hold sexist or negative beliefs about women. The data from the study were drawn from the GSS, which is a huge personal interview survey that's been done every 2 years, dating back to 1973. The men who, what did the survey uncover? The survey uncovered that men who watch porn, actually, I should say it a different way. Men who admit to watching porn are slightly more likely to identify as feminist than those who don't admit to watching porn. On the topic of women in positions of power, non-watchers of porn were slightly more likely to say that either women should focus on taking care of their homes, or that they would be against a woman being president, or that they believe men are simply better suited emotionally for politics. So non-watchers of porn were slightly more sexist and misogynistic on that question. Also, non-watchers of porn were slightly more likely to think that women should only be working inside of the home. Also, when it comes to abortion, non-watchers of porn were slightly more likely to be against abortion. And lastly, non-watchers of porn were slightly more likely to favor the so-called traditional family arrangement where the male is the breadwinner. The margins by which there was a difference on these questions between the porn watchers and the non-porn watchers was pretty small. But this is the most important paragraph from an interview with the study's lead author, Taylor Kohut. Quote, "It's important to keep in mind that correlation should not imply causation. My colleagues and I think that our findings are best explained by third variable factors. There are certain groups of people that avoid porn who also tend to hold more gender non-egalitarian attitudes. If we assume that there is no relationship between pornography use and gender egalitarianism, then including these people will lead to a positive bias in the results. Our findings may simply reflect the presence of people who avoid porn use and hold more gender non-egalitarian attitudes in our sample." In other words, if you don't watch porn or lie and say you don't watch porn, you may also be, for example, part of a religious conservative group, which is already more likely to hold non-egalitarian points of view. Thus, it is not that the porn is in any way causally related to the lack of sexist or misogynistic views, but rather that there are third variables that are influencing this. Another element is that people often lie about watching porn. So it could be that those who are willing to admit that they watch porn might already be more open when it comes to gender roles and egalitarian ideas. Yes, correlation and causation are two different things, but very often correlation can be very interesting to analyze and discuss, and this is absolutely one of those cases. And I look forward to hearing from you about your thoughts on this study. We have a voicemail number. The number is 219-2DavidP. Here's an example of those really angry people that are just very angry about autonomous vehicles. Take a listen to this.
David and Laris, these automatic vehicles are just a commie liberal plot to take away our masculinity and turn all American men into faggots.
Right.
Obama wants to castrate all our young boys and turn us into commie liberals.
Yep, so this is an idea that if men aren't allowed to drive their manly trucks anymore because of autonomous vehicles, it's all part of Obama's plan to, I mean, as this guy said, and this is very offensive language, turn everybody into faggots, which is not exactly what I would say, but just an example. People get very, very upset about autonomous vehicles. On today's bonus show, we will talk about Lewis's whereabouts, the update with Boston. We will talk about next week. We will talk about the Haytriot mail calendar and much more. Go to davidpakman.com/membership. Sign up today. Get the bonus show.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.